because this is the group is focused on geospatial analysis, I thought I'd highlight that map and talk about the world turned upside down as a title that might catch your attention today. So the background context to this is, I'm hoping that you have seen the paper on which, where that map was presented. So the paper was published earlier this year, and it is focused or aimed at ecologists primarily, but I think what we've tried to do in that is provide a framework for addressing issues of colonial mindsets and colonial thinking that are across science. And in some ways, as I've said in other contexts, but it feels to me like what we've written in that paper is kind of like an inner monologue I've had for a long time. I am a scientist from India. I got my undergraduate training and early graduate training in India before coming to the US for a PhD. And I've more or less remained at US institutions ever since. And in that sense, coming from a former colony and also having a rather oppressive British advisor for my PhD in the US, I've had some personal experiences of the colonial context and how people's attitudes and perceptions can influence the kind of work you do and how you approach doing science in other countries. At the same time, my co-authors on that paper, Chris Rissos, he was a postdoc of mine a few years ago. He is now at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, which is where he did his undergraduate work. So he's gone back to his former institution, and Jess Auerbach, our other co-author, is an anthropologist also from South Africa. So both of them also had sort of similar experiences of coming from South Africa, getting trained in the UK and in the US, and having these experiences of being scientists from a global South country, functioning within and being trained in doing ecology or anthropology in the global North, and the contradictions and challenges that come from being in that position. And so when I was advising Chris as a postdoc, we got to talking about some of these issues, and then at the same time, he had been talking to Jess, and I think one of the things that motivated them was that in 2015, I think it was 2015, that the University of Cape Town had strong student movements and protests pushing for decolonizing the curriculum across the university, and also severing sort of the shadow of the colonial racist past. And that also took the form of something that we've seen around here, which is tearing down statues of colonial figures. So in that case, they did that on their campus, and it was kind of thinking in terms of, so this is a statue of Rhodes. So it's like examining the legacy of how the colonial mindset has shaped contemporary realities in Africa or in India and other parts of the developing world, and then trying to fit that into the context or contrasting it with what we are experiencing as scientists working within the global North. And it's interesting also to think about the US, because I think Ian mentioned about how today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and you have this interesting colonial legacy within the US, where the US history itself, in terms of the history of the United States as a nation, starts with the idea that you overthrew the colonial rule of the British, and the War of Independence and all of that. But so you have this tension in terms of whether historically the US was a colony that freed itself, or while at the same time remaining a colonial agent that was oppressing people within the US. So what does all of this mean to the way we approach science and scholarship and the way we conduct our research? And more specifically thinking about the context in which your group thinks, I think, in terms of maps and how you represent the world and different aspects of the reality of the world visually through maps, and where you have the colonial or the structures that are internalized that shape the way you represent the world in maps or represent aspects of the world through maps. So what we try to do in our paper is not just critique it, because there is a fairly robust body of criticism from people who study science and from anthropologists and philosophers and certainly a lot of social scientists who have critiqued science for its colonial hang-ups or colonial frameworks. And there's a pretty rich body of literature on decolonization per se, as a process, as a practice in scholarship, in anthropology and social sciences. But most of us in the natural sciences do not get exposed to that at all. So part of our goal was to draw from that literature and get people thinking about what it actually means for practicing scientists. But we can't let this just be the domain of philosophers and social scientists who study science. We have to actually change the practice of science. So that was part of our motivation. And the other part was, rather than just adding another criticism, we also wanted to offer some practical suggestions or pathways to doing science in a better way, in ways that gets around some of these embedded biases, which we've argued strongly that they actually limit the quality of our science. So they're not just bad from social viewpoints or from the point of politics and cultural oppression and so on, but they're actually harmful to the way we conduct science as well. So we identified 5 shifts that, if you see the paper, of these. So the 5 shifts that we think are steps, and not necessarily steps to be taken in any particular order. That's why we have the figure as a circular image. But essentially things that we need to do to shift our thinking and the way we practice what we do. So I'll get to that in a minute, but let's talk about maps and talk about why. Several of you have said you found the map intriguing and you want to know more about the map. So I'm curious to know, before I talk about how the map struck other people, I'm curious to hear more from you guys about what your impression was when you saw the map, and how often do you see maps like that? As people who work with maps all the time.
Pretty much never see them in that orientation.
Okay, that's interesting. Anyone else? No, that's.
Well, I had a question about the names. I mean, the European names. So why were the numbers low in Europe?
Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that there is lower species diversity in Europe. Tropics generally tend to have more species. So that's part of it. And I think also when Linnaeus, set up the classification, it was based, if you think about the historical development of taxonomy with the binomial nomenclature set up by Linnaeus, and taxonomists in Europe assigning names at that point, those are based on species that were already known, that had common names that especially for birds, most of the birds in Europe are already known to people. So therefore, it wasn't a new discovery that could be named in honor of some sponsor or some scientist or some patron of the sciences or anything like that. So I think that's probably a factor. So they tend to be more descriptive, more informative about the science. Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah.
Also
So I think
hotspots in some countries where it was really, really high numbers. There were some hotspots like South America where it was very high numbers.
Yeah, that really reflects a large part of that is the extreme high diversity of species in South America and Africa. Because global in terms of bird diversity hotspots. Anyway, so we're talking about species diversity of birds. South America and Africa, the tropics in general tend to have higher species diversity. South America is known for its extremely high diversity, especially in the Amazon and the tropical parts of the Andes. So that's partly, I think, an artifact of the distribution of species diversity to begin with. But it also reflects the fact that these were places that were, quote unquote, discovered by Western scientists or European scientists who went on these big expeditions. If you think about Alexander von Humboldt's expeditions, or many others that have gone down to South America, during the period of colonization, and especially in the 18th, 19th century big expeditions when a lot of these natural history discoveries were made. So a lot of the names come from people who went exploring in that fashion. And therefore, you see a high number of species. And I would suspect that even if you were to convert that to sort of proportion of species that are named after Europeans, you might find a similar pattern that you'll have a higher proportion of species in Latin America and parts of Africa that are named after European names rather than and certainly not too many indigenous names retained. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I guess I just was curious also if you'd like to talk about the motivation for the orientation of the map.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. So yeah, if there's no other questions, I'll talk about why we did that. And to be honest, we didn't really think too much about it. There wasn't any particular strong motivation or messaging. It seemed, especially with the two South African, co-authors, I think they've been more sensitive to the way maps represent Africa, especially, and then the Southern Hemisphere. So if you think about people from that perspective, the bias is more obvious to people living in the South. The Southern Hemisphere in general, if you look at the typical Mercator projections, you obviously see the bias in terms of land masses, Greenland and North America looking a lot bigger than Africa and so on. And those things should be obvious to people doing geospatial analysis like you guys. But I think part of the challenge, part of the motivation was to sort of, in a sense, to represent not just the distribution of names, but also to reflect on how maps typically present the world to us, right? So if you're living in the Southern Hemisphere, the North being at the top and the Northern Hemisphere appearing sort of somewhat disproportionate seemed like a benign choices to us. But if you're living in the Southern Hemisphere, that strikes you more strongly. That's one part of it. The other part was to, in some way, sort of get people to pause and think about what you're looking at. Right? If it's a regular, more typical orientation map, it may have had less impact than this one has had, because it has certainly led to a lot of questions like this: to why do you do this? Why is the map quote unquote upside down? And that the reaction to the map has actually come as an interesting, stronger impact of the paper, I think, than we were expecting. Especially because we had a fair amount of criticism and pushback of the map on social media. Several right-wing, Twitter accounts, for example, that have large followings, jumped on the map and critiqued nature for trying to be, woke or to be like teen woke. They took us to task talking about, how the compass always points north, and how do you not know that? And there were also tweets, suggesting how, basically we don't understand the world. And then the funniest thing was several people went to the trouble of fixing it for us. They actually took the figure and sent it, tweeted it back in the correct orientation with Europe on top and Africa below. So that was kind of funny and interesting. And if you pause and think about why does that map strike people so strongly? If you think from a neutral viewpoint, from a geography viewpoint, or from the viewpoint of trying to map this sphere that we live on, north and south are arbitrary, right? They simply have to do with the axis, of the magnetic fields, and the axis around which the Earth rotates around the sun. So given that north and south really don't have a whole lot more meaning, if you then pause and think about why is it that maps tend to show it that way? Well, you have to go back to thinking about where did these maps originate. Even more striking than our simple, rotating the map along one axis, if you think about, we still kept the other axis in the traditional orientation, in the sense that we still have, the longitude. The map is still centered on 0 degree longitude on the GMT, if you will. That's arbitrary as well. So why does 0 have to go through Europe? That's even more arbitrary compared to the north and south, right? So if you pause and think about why is it that the maps typically show it in this way, you have to think about where did these maps originate? Who came up with these systems of representing the world in this way? Who drew maps? And when you think about how and why maps are drawn and who drew them, you have to go back to, to realize that maps have always been political. Right? Maps, people draw maps, to get a representation of the world, to find it, direction, to orient themselves in the world, and to be able to, go from one place to another. But often maps, especially the boundaries, are always political boundaries. And there is a lot of political power in maps. Right? Drawing maps on paper is how a lot of national boundaries have been determined in this world by colonial powers. Right? So a lot of the maps that you see around the world, especially the national boundaries, are a legacy of colonial histories. They may not reflect, they quite often do not reflect the geography or the biogeography or the geology of places. Right? There's not too many maps that necessarily follow watersheds. There are many boundaries that do, but many don't. They also often do not represent the cultural geography. There are many examples of colonized nations having been split up by the colonizers in ways that split ethnicities and populations and communities apart. I come from India, and the partition of India and Pakistan was a horrendous event in our history. And it still carries a lot of legacy effects. That was a legacy of colonization as well. And that early political process of decolonization, which still hasn't really been completely resolved in the context of India and Pakistan, because the disputes continue. And yeah, I can also tell you that when this was a while ago now, but I remember giving from my PhD research, where I was studying migratory birds, that warblers that migrated from Central Asia into Southern India. And I was studying their winter ecology in Southern India. And at a seminar in India, I just sort of had a, this was the early days of PowerPoint, in fact, and I had just used one of those built-in map templates for South Asia to map the migration pattern of the birds. And somebody in the audience got up and sort of challenged me for, why are you showing this map? Because it doesn't represent, the boundary between India and Pakistan up in Kashmir properly. Because it was kind of, India and Pakistan and China have been at war over these things for a long time, and the maps in that region are disputed. So I had to say, it's like I'm only showing it for representation, and I'm more concerned about how birds see the geography of the place and how they migrate across these landscapes, and not so much about what the political boundaries are. But even in that context, the political boundary to an ecologist in the audience was offensive. So one of the things that we need to think about when we talk about decolonizing is we have to critically analyze the proximity of the science that we do to political power. Right? Political power determines who gets to draw maps and what kind of maps are drawn, because maps are an expression of the way you view the world, but they're also an expression of power. And in this context, I think it's also useful to think about the more recent tools and opportunities available for, and also these movements for crowdsourcing maps, where people get involved in creating maps and often you might end up with sort of quirky maps that represent somebody's individual geographic interests, or you might get communities mapping resources for themselves, right? So these are all efforts that can potentially challenge the hegemony of official maps, or maps that are politically imposed, and look more at what the actual distribution of some landscape and resources might mean for a given community. So on the global scale, this so-called upside down map highlights to me how deeply embedded the colonial framework is in everybody's mind, in all of our minds. That this simple act of sort of flipping the map on just one axis gives so much pause and cause so much consternation among people that, oh, this is not the usual map. Why did you do this? I mean, why do it the other way? Right? I might as well ask that. Why is north always at the top? It's just arbitrary, isn't it? There is no real scientific rationale for doing it that way. When you have a sphere that you're trying to project into 2 dimensions, it could be anyway. Yes, we have a north and south because of the magnetic polarization. So maybe you want to keep that up and down, but which way is up and which way is down doesn't really matter. And it shouldn't matter in terms of representing the actual geography of whatever it is you're trying to map, right? Or should it? So think about any maps that you're drawing for any region. Do you think the information you're trying to convey or map is going to change significantly if you were to change its orientation? How important is this standard orientation to the actual information you're trying to convey through your maps? And that's a question for all of you. And in general, whoever is drawing maps. Why are we so committed to having maps in a particular way? Obviously, one obvious reason is we like to have some conventions that make it easier for people to understand what you're showing. So, you have the standard orientation makes it easy for people to relate to them, and it's useful for communication and so on. But at the same time, asking the question as to why is that the standard orientation? And what might have happened if we had, some southern hemisphere culture or society had been the colonizing force? Would we have ended up with very different maps? Quite likely, isn't it? And if you go back to the colonial maps from before, the reason we commemorate this day, which was the discovery of North America, maps were, the world was considered flat by many people. Maps had an actual edge, and people were afraid that these ships would fall off the edge. Yet they made it across, and eventually we realized that the world is a sphere. But the maps that the cartographers of the time were drawing were limited to Europe and expanded from there. And in some ways, the mapping of North America, we talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition and these other big efforts that led to the entire continent being mapped. These are all tied with colonial expansion. And even now, if you look at, for example, if you go to, for doing land acknowledgements, right? You have native-land.ca. That's the website. If you go look at that site, you'll see maps showing what the original distribution of indigenous people across North America were. And those maps, of course, boundaries are fuzzy. They overlap in all kinds of ways. You have very different colors, and they don't correspond to anything that you recognize as boundaries in North America right now. So clearly, people at that time had their own maps and had their own geographical orientations. So why is the current one the superior way of doing it compared to anything else? And I think that gets back to the heart of the question of how colonial frameworks and mindsets shape our approach to the science we do and how we conduct our science. So in that sense, I think it's a long answer to that question, but I think we chose the map without really having deep conversations along these lines. These conversations actually happened after we saw the reaction to the map. But for us, it was just a simple decision that, okay, let's just flip it and focus on the South for a change. And the fact that even that simple act stirred up so much debate or discussion or criticism tells me that we hit a target of sorts that people are sensitive about. And it sort of makes you pause and sit up and think. So I think this gets at one of the first big steps we've talked about, or one of the core things that we talked about in terms of shifts in practice, which is decolonizing our minds. Right? So we have to find ways to step outside the colonial frameworks of thinking that are embedded in our education and in our training and in our background, as well as in our culture. And these maps are everywhere, ubiquitous, for example. So anyone looking at maps sort of expects them in a certain way. So that's part of our shared cultural and scientific framework. So as scientists, if we talk about trying to be objective and rational and critical thinkers, it's quite right to start by asking the question as to why is the map the way it is? Because the world isn't really that way. The world is a sphere. So why does a particular representation prevail? And what are the roots of that? So that kind of, both decolonizing your mind and knowing your history, these are two big shifts that we're recommending, is part of trying to look at the orientation of the world through other perspectives. So the simple perspective I gave, and my co-author Jess Auerbach tells the story of how this question of map sort of was illuminated to her, because when she was in elementary school, and she said that they had sort of a geography lesson, and the teacher had brought in a globe, and so as he was describing the maps and showing them the globe, he sort of pulled the globe itself off of its mount and turned it around, showed them various things, and then just tossed it to the class and said, take a closer look at it. And everybody passed it to, from one hand to another. They tossed it around in the class, they played with it, and then eventually put it back, and it was put back arbitrarily. And it ended up with a very different orientation. Maybe it was upside down. And that's when he said, she said that he taught them this lesson of how their colonial history has determined how the earth itself is shown. So I think both in terms of understanding how a particular historically influenced cultural view of the world forms the basis of our science is very important. To understand that the reason we have a certain, even these theoretical frameworks or systems of projecting coordinates and so on are rooted in people who invented them and people who came from certain backgrounds and cultures, and therefore you cannot separate that colonial history and the political sort of history of how these systems were created from the product itself. You can also think about, I study ecology and I look at distributions of species, so sort of biogeography is something that I really love studying. And often a lot of our conservation problems in the world right now often arise from conflicts around borders. And by that I mean you have, in recent years there's been a lot of movement to try and create thinking and approaches to conservation that are transboundary initiatives that go across national boundaries and try to get agencies from different countries involved in protecting land or biodiversity and so on. And again, that reflects the fact that other species have very different boundaries that they pay attention to and that are more ecologically rooted. Right? The range of a species, you can map that, and that may or may not correspond to any kind of human political maps that we draw. So if you want to save a species, like the let's say the Mexican, the Southwest jaguar that comes into Arizona perhaps, or species that are sort of specific to the Sonoran Desert, for example, with most of which is in the US, some of it is in Arizona. You have a very hot contested political border that bisects the range of those species. And the political conflicts around protecting that border, building a wall and all of that has resulted in a lot of ecological damage that conservationists are really upset about, that the jaguar's movements are going to be harmed if you build a wall, that there's been actual destruction of habitat with these attempts to try and build walls and all the policing and everything else that goes along there. So maps are political, boundaries are politically very powerful and can have very strong real impacts on the world around them. And they derive from or are closely driven by geopolitical motivations, which obviously ties directly back to processes of colonization. Right? So we have to know your history. And for that, I'd say, from a geography perspective, you have to know the history of how a particular region was inhabited by people and how the kinds of maps people drew. But then if you're a biogeographer, you're also going to look at prehistory, right? Before humans, and what were the geological and ecological processes and distributions of species that shaped things. So you might look at glacial maps, or you might look at maps of how sea levels rose and dropped, and how that shaped connectivity across the landscape for different species. And a lot of that doesn't correspond to political maps. So that's hopefully that gives you some things to think about in terms of the significance of looking at maps critically and shifting your mindset, decolonizing your mind when you look at the landscape and the map, and also incorporating history. The other parts that we've emphasized in our paper, is decolonizing data and access to data. And that again is extremely important in the context of maps and geography, especially with all the tools that we have available now for people to be able to create maps at many different levels. There's a lot of progress and activism around maps where people are taking the tools, democratizing the tools, and using them to map various aspects of things that are important to them. So you can get things like, what was that? The apps that map the distribution of bathrooms and quality of bathrooms. Remember, what is that app called? I don't remember what the app was called, but you have that kind of thing which is crowdsourced. Of course, Google Maps, there's lots of information you can add to it. You guys know a lot more about the crowdsourcing of maps than I do, I'm sure. But you also have maps that are being created by communities for mapping the distribution of natural resources, for mapping the distribution of species, for taking control of their own landscapes in a way that you can connect local knowledge to the distribution of maps. And I think these local knowledge mapping is also becoming extremely important in the context of climate change. When climate zones are shifting, ranges of species are shifting, and it's important to draw on historical and local knowledge to be able to come up with strategies that might help both people and other species to be able to ride over or tide over the changes that are coming because of climate change. And then the other aspects of doing this, especially with crowdsourcing, the natural connection that comes with it is we have to take approaches that are inclusive and working in inclusive teams. Again, I love geography and I love biogeography because I think these are inherently interdisciplinary fields, right? Geography informs so many other disciplines and is informed by so many other disciplines. And all of you have different disciplinary training. So I'm sure when you're pulling it together for your various projects, whether it's looking at energy, power systems, or any of the various projects that you mentioned, you are drawing from multiple disciplines. So being interdisciplinary is important, and I think this training is probably giving you some insight into the challenges of communicating across academic disciplines and also giving you skills to be able to do it effectively, to be able to translate from one discipline to another and to be able to create maps that can do the translation. But at the same time, you can broaden that thinking to think about, okay, it's not just about academic disciplines. It's also about tapping into local knowledges. What do indigenous communities or local communities know about the distribution of particular species or distribution of natural features, distribution of certain resources, hydrologies, various things, and partnering with communities to be able to engage them in the process of doing this kind of research in a truly collaborative way where they get stakes in the process and also get benefits in currencies and in ways that matter to them, just like we try to do our research to get our publications and to advance our careers. So thinking pluralistically about different local knowledges and how they map onto the world and how they map onto the way we view the world can help broaden our thinking. And it can also help empower local communities in being able to negotiate with science and the powers that are aligned with science to be able to get better outcomes for all the communities. So I think I'm going to pause there, and yeah, I've spoken for quite a bit. So I'll open up for discussion and any questions people have or any criticisms, anything like that. I hope you found this useful so far. And with everybody's cameras turned off, I can't see any reaction, so it's kind of hard for me to gauge where we are.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, we have about 10 minutes left or so. So feel free to unmute, put your video on, and ask some questions.
This is more a comment, I think, going back to the map orientation. This is Perver. For my class, I'm using a small expert from a West Wing episode where
yes.
Do you know that, where there is some discussion
Yes, of course,
with the team of cartographers, and
yes,
if you change the direction of the map, whatever, and just people say, okay, it drives me crazy because yes, when I'm looking to your map, I'm trying to map actually countries that I know, and in the mind kind of struggles a little bit to locate those, particularly since they are not the political boundaries.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, orientation has certain social meaning associated with it that people attach, like up, down, developed, undeveloped, and even in terms of food, we know North food is not as hot as South food, and this is, I mean, from some countries that I'm aware, that's the case actually. So yes, the orientation has some hidden meanings that we are used to, but those are still social constructions in a sense, like
exactly
how people have done this through time, and there is no like objective standard way of doing things because someone just invented this, and okay, it's a convention. As I said, I was trying to kind of locate certain countries in those maps, and it's not so easy. I mean, it takes some time, but it's interesting exercise to do.
Yeah, I think it is a good practical exercise also to periodically just do that for ourselves, because it gets you out of your head in a way, to get you to, look at it literally from a different angle.
Right, you may see certain things that you usually do not see.
Yeah, and certainly when we think about how we want to visualize data, you want to put the data that's most important most prominently. So why aren't we doing that with maps? And part of the problem, I guess, is the tools. So if there's a tool that would allow you to just like automatically reorient the map based on the which data is the most interesting, that would be helpful to bring that into more common practice. And really, it's just about habits, right?
It is about
reading it a certain way, and it is a convention, but you can also introduce new conventions.
I mean, in a way, it's kind of like language, right? We've come down to a common language, like we are talking in English right now, although all of us have different native languages here. I think multiple ones in this small group. Why are we speaking in English? Because that's the conventional language that dominates our disciplines, our academy in general. But think about what you lose when you're translating into your native languages or back to English. There are concepts that you sometimes cannot translate. And if you think about language, maps as sort of a visual language, then are there things that we're losing when we do it this way? Right? Do we need to think about other aspects that can be visualized differently in maps?
Actually, together with the language is also how we write. We are used to in Western world write from left to right, and always we present PowerPoints. We kind of try to put most important things on the left and then a little bit less on the right. But for certain languages where they write from right to left, I have seen this with my students when I work, let's say, they start from right to left, and I say, no, but then I kind of realize there is the reason why our minds work certain way, or not, are up and down, like certain languages do not write from left to right, but up down kind of thing. So this is all in a sense embedded in our minds to a certain degree based on where we grew up.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as people training in sciences, as practicing scientists, as academics or even practitioners, I think it's important for us to develop that flexibility in our mind where we can shift across frames to be able to look at things in a different way. That will help not only, sometimes occasionally give you insight into things that you may have missed because of the left-right versus right-left orientation, for example, that you simply emphasize certain things more simply because it's on the left. If you develop the flexibility to be able to switch doing that, and likewise, switching the way we look at maps, it might give you new insights. And it's also practically very useful in becoming a better communicator, right? So you might be able to be more effective. So even something as simple as if you're giving a talk at a conference in South Africa or Australia, just think of how how well you would connect with the audience if you use a map that puts Australia and South Africa on top, right? As a communication tool, I can imagine that would be a big plus to winning over the audience. If you put their country, or if you change the centrality of where your map is focused. So there's practical benefits for doing that, but I think they actually give us meaningful insight that we might miss if we don't consider these factors, consider the biases embedded in our frameworks.
Well, we're about at 2 p.m. So I think we can call it. I think this is a very good talk. I thank you, Dr. Katti. I know I learned a lot, even though I've read the paper multiple times, but I still learn something every time I hear you speak. So thank you.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Of course. And for everyone else on the call, we have GIS week coming up the middle of November, starting on the 15th. And because of that, we won't be having another Lunch and Learn this term, but we hope everybody can take part in the discussions and events that we'll be having during that week. So thank you again.
So if there's one parting message I might leave with you, especially given that it's Indigenous Peoples Day, I'd suggest that whatever study area that you're working with, see if you can find Indigenous maps of those regions and look at what they look like. Try to map whatever it is you're mapping in your projects. Try to map it on local knowledge, local perspective, just as a fun exercise, and see if it gives you some different insights into your work. I'll leave you with that thought.
Nice. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Nice to meet you.